Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar, Garbage In, Garbage Out, how to ensure high quality data for AI ready pipelines. I'm really thrilled to be hosting this webinar with Thomas, who I'll introduce in a second. But just to give you a bit of a agenda, can we just flip back to the previous slide? There's a few things that we want to cover with you all today. So we want to talk a bit about how data quality issues and problems manifest in organizations. And we want to dive into some of the root causes, but we don't want to keep it too theoretical. We're diving into those root causes so we can understand how companies can address them. And we want to spend a chunk of time thinking through some practical approaches. And I've got lots of questions for my guest on that particularly. And we're really keen to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So we want to hear from you. If you've got questions, please put them. There's a chat window in the Zoom. Please put the questions directly in the chat window. Also, any comments, if anything you say we disagree with or whatever, let us know. We've got a section at the end of the webinar that will go into them, but I'll try and keep my eyes on the chat box as we go. And so, if possible, I will try and pick them up a little bit earlier. So that's what we hope to cover, but let me introduce myself and my guest. So very fortunate to be joined by Thomas, who's CEO and founder at Tasman Analytics. And I'll Thomas, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about
I was waiting to hear your introduction. Yali, I was looking forward to that. No, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to talk about data quality. Topic that's very close to our hearts at Tasman for sure. It comes up in every single project we run, and typically not in ways that you might expect. So it'll be useful to go through some nice scenarios and concrete examples. But first things first, my name is Thomas. I run Tasman. We are a boutique agency. We work with ambitious companies to build good and high quality, best-in-class data capabilities. We do that typically by coming in to help you build or extend your data infrastructure, to help you identify, build, and deliver insight that actually drives business value. So not just a ream of dashboards that no one uses, but actually thinking through what's necessary for you in a business to make better decisions and help you do that. And last but not least, we also help our clients build internal data teams. So typically we come in for 5-6 months, help you set up those first proper data stacks if you're starting out in a startup, or if you're a bigger enterprise company, help you run this skunkworks prototype, event governance framework project, for instance, and then help you also onboard an internal team that take over from us, or help you train and accelerate an internal team. It's been going on for about 7 years now. We're working with about 65 clients, most of them startups, with a few big organizations and charity companies, NGOs in there as well. Our mission very much is to help all of these companies get better at data through better decision making. Actually, the other way around: get better at decision making through better data. That's it. See, don't put the cart before the horse. As part of this, we're also very happy to offer a free consult to anybody joining this webinar. So if you go to tasman.ai/data-quality, be able to book a meeting with me and talk through any data quality issues that you might encounter. I promise to give my advice succinctly, concisely, and without pitching too much within that hour that you get from us there.
Thanks,
Yali,
Thomas.
I'm looking forward to this.
I'm very much looking forward to this. And the reason, Thomas, I'm so excited to have you to talk about this with is that wealth of experience. I've been lucky to work with Thomas from even before he was
That's correct. It's a long time ago,
Tasman, and
yeah.
we've done a lot of joint projects together. So I know he brings a wealth of practical insight that I want to make sure we explore in this session. Just to give a super quick intro to me and to Snowplow for those of you on the webinar who might not know. So my name is Yali. I'm one of the two co-founders at Snowplow and our chief technology officer. And for those who don't know, Snowplow is customer data infrastructure. So it's all the technology that an organization needs to collect and operationalize behavioral data at scale. Behavioral data is data that describes what your customers are doing second by second and minute by minute. I'm a data person by training. This is an incredibly exciting data set because it tells you what decisions people are making, but also how they're making those decisions and the environmental factors that are true as those decisions are being made. So you really understand why and how they make those decisions. And for AI, it's rocket fuel because it's the data so predictive. unfortunately, there's a bunch of challenges around this data that we look to help our customers solve around quality and trustworthiness, which will be the focus of this webinar, real-time delivery, which is sort of self-explanatory, making the data easy for AI to understand, which is becoming more and more relevant in kind of the agentic world that we're moving to, making it easy to feature engineer on. And again, increasingly important for this AI world that we're moving to, not just capturing the customer behavior, but actually capturing the behavior of AIs and agents and being able to build that full OODA loop so you can understand and optimize machine learning processes at everything from sort of classical machine learning processes to multi-agent systems. So that's us. But let's dive into the topics. So I think if we take we can take the slides down now, Thomas. I can turn my attention to you.
Yeah, we can see you in full glory here, Yali. Hello.
And I guess a question to start off, it'd be wrong or feel wrong not to start on AI. Everybody's talking about AI. AI is the hot thing at the moment. Data quality is more of a longer term topic. We've been talking about data quality. It's been, I think, a pretty big topic over the last 5 years. What do you think has changed with the growing adoption of AI and particularly Gen AI when it comes to data quality?
Well, that's why we're all here to try and figure this out together. I can speak to what I see in small, fast-growing companies. Maybe those are companies that are a bit quicker in deploying Gen AI solutions than big organizations. But maybe the challenges are also a bit more particular to small companies. But let's use that as a sort of microcosm of AI challenges and data quality. Data quality is extremely important for AI applications, but maybe not in the way that people think. So for us, this is less about making sure the data is structured, which is the thing that people associate most with data quality. Like, is it nicely tabularized? Can I load it easily into a database? Are all the numbers popping up as numbers, or are some of them popping up as varchars or strings in my database? So, what we see is that if you are interested in seeing AI as an application of your data platform, which is where we think it belongs, then this actually gives you the ability to be a little bit looser with structuring the data up front, because a lot of Gen AI applications in particular are able to consume from relatively unstructured data, whether that is big reams of text or PDF documents, even multimodal content that you can upload. And of course, lakehouses are very well suited to all of that, which is why we're quite interested in seeing Databricks, for instance, raise a rather large amount of money over the last couple of days to really build that future of lakehousing there. So structured data is less important to Gen AI applications than the ability of companies to trust the accuracy of the data that they have. And for me, that confidence and that trustworthiness is much more important, but is also much more ephemeral, much harder to build up. Very easy to lose, of course, as they say, but much harder to build up from scratch. And so being able now to talk to clients and prospects and other businesses and talk to them about, well, do you trust the data that you get in your warehouse? It might all be nicely structured into well-labeled tables, but do you trust the lifetime value number that you get out of that? Do you trust the number of registrations that you had yesterday? Do you trust the funnel completion rates that you get out of this data? Those become the important questions, because that's what you're going to build any AI application on top of, whether that is classic machine learning patterns, conversion drivers, segmentation of customer bases, churn analysis, those different things, or whether it is more Gen AI applications ranging from, say, agentic customer support, where you do not want to use the wrong number of transactions that someone has actually had in your e-commerce shop, all the way through to much more compelling, I think, decision-making agents or predictive agents that help you meaningfully improve things in the business that you can't improve at the moment without Gen AI. You need good data quality, good data trustworthiness in there. And then, of course, you get into, well, what does it take to get to data trustworthiness? And I wonder, maybe, Yali, throwing a question back at you, having been in customer data for the better part of 10 years, why is data trust still such a fickle issue in 2025? Didn't we solve this 7-8 years ago already?
So it's a good question. and I want to answer it, but I want to go back to a couple of points that you think are that you made that I think really interesting, and tease them out before coming back to the question of trustworthiness, which I think is a really important one. There, with the advent of Gen AI, suddenly we can build intelligent applications on unstructured data.
Yeah.
And we can do that at scale and in ways that wasn't possible before. And that's very exciting. But it means that all the focus on data schema and structure that was so much of what kind of the focus from a technology perspective in data quality before doesn't really carry over to those data sources and those types of applications. My personal view is that we're in a particular sort of point where most of the Gen AI apps that you're seeing, most of the agentic applications are focused on unstructured data because that's the new novel thing we haven't been able to do before.
Yeah.
But my expectation is that we're going to see those agentic applications working more and more with structured data and actually figuring out how to make them work with structured and precise data is like something that the industry is figuring out. So the way I sort of think about it is you have structured data and unstructured data, and both of those are important in these applications. And trust is important across all of them, which is why your question is such a good one, Thomas. And schema and structure is a relevant set of considerations just for half of it, just for the structured bit. But we've got to think about trustworthiness across the whole set. And that's fundamentally a very hard problem because you're really talking to, is this data accurate? Is this data complete? And it's like, how do you know that a ruler is accurate, or how do you know that your watch is telling you the right time? You need some ultimate watch, or like define a second as a number of vibrations of cesium. I can't remember what it is. Some oscillation.
133, I think.
Some element doing some something. But there used to be a meter rule in. I think it was in Paris. It was kept, and that was the meter, and all other meters were measured against it. When companies are collecting data, and I don't like the term collecting data. Maybe that's something we'll explore later on in the.
We shall
in this discussion. They've got nothing to measure it against, so trust is lost when people look at the numbers and they're like, that doesn't feel right, which can be grossly unfair because the number can be right and people are wrong all the time. But it's very hard to build that trust. It's easy to say this is a number, this is a string, and test for that, which is why I think we've been so focused on schema, because it was the easier problem to solve. But meaning is the harder problem to solve, and there are approaches to solving it. There are tests you can run to make sure that, in the case of event tracking, which is obviously the part of the market that I focus on, that an add to basket is only triggered when somebody adds something to basket, not when somebody removes something from basket. So those kind of the techniques to checking that kind of code, but they're not perfect. It's hard to get full coverage, and then once the data is collected, it's very hard to take that data and compare it against what actually happened. You end up kind of triangulating, and there's a children's story about someone who's sure that their clocks are out, and they end up having to buy a watch to check that the clocks are right, and you end up with two data sources that you don't trust. Like, proliferating data sources doesn't sort of solve the trust problem. And so maybe this is a good sort of segue into the conceiving of different ways to solve the trust issue. How do you think about trust and solving trust?
Yeah, I mean, I also love the way that you went from definitions of seconds all the way to buying more clocks to get your right time definitions in place. I think trust is fickle, but it can be built. And I think that you're right that if you do talk about Gen AI applications, linking to that, you're going to have tiering of data sources like we have already. Most setters will be familiar with gold, silver, bronze type tiering of data quality or data reliability. I think you're going to see the same thing in providing context or any other augmentation to agentic models, because you're going to have to tell it one way or the other. This is absolute core truth versus this is context that you can be a bit looser with, or that you can interpret a bit more. And that's quite a powerful model where you can do a bit of a hierarchy of training data in that way. And one of the things that, well, you and I have discussed this a couple of times, and I'm very keen on, we're starting to deploy it over the next couple of months as well, is to think about knowledge maps and giving structured context into GenAI applications where you can make the difference, the differentiation between this is qualitative data versus quantitative data. This is qualitative information about a particular business domain, about particular types of interactions you have with customers. And this is the average lifetime value for this cohort. And this is the average repeat purchase rate for this particular segment of customers that are more accurate and testable and rigorous. And I think that, yeah, we have focused a lot on event governance because it seemed to be the most low-hanging piece of fruit. And actually, we still struggle with this. A large amount of our starting clients will come in and analyze and audit what's currently there, and they will have 100 versions of the same event just because anytime they send it into their current end-to-end CDP, for instance, they might make a small little nuanced change in the event definition, which means that the CDP doing what it's supposed to do will create a slightly different event type for it. And all of a sudden you end up with 100 different page view events rather than the single one that you need in order to build a correct data model on top of. And I think that's still table stakes to figure out first before you can build a source of truth on top of that. But don't forget about building the source of truth on top of that either. It's not enough to have correct event data. You need to make sure that you're not missing any obvious customer interactions. You need to make sure that when you are talking about lifetime value, that you're not forgetting to add or subtract VAT in the right possible ways. And those things, much more than the technology layer that event governance is, those meaning problems, they require subject matter expertise. And so I see data teams, I think it's already happening with analysts for sure, but I see data teams really move towards being stronger if they got more subject matter expertise about the domains that they're supposed to build infrastructure for. And it means that even as a data engineer, and certainly as an analytics engineer, you're really supposed to understand the context within which you do your analysis or within which you're building your data infrastructure, because that's the only way that you know whether your repeat purchase data is actually correct or whether it's completely nonsensical. By the way, I think GenAI tooling is a phenomenal ally in that. As in, I use it all the time to try and understand whether I have benchmarks for particular KPIs in industries. What's the benchmark for a good onboarding completion rate in mobile gaming? What's the benchmark number for a great e-commerce repeat rate purchases for low-value purchases versus high-value purchases? Those different things are much easier to research these days than they were back in the day. So yes, in summary, I think trusted can be built, but it requires subject matter expertise, and that's not something that most data teams are set up for at the moment. And my advice is very much to either go out into the business and talk to the business folks to build that context yourself, or to consider hiring maybe a performance marketeer into your analysis team in order to get more marketing context. Hire a product designer into your data team in order to get more product context and get that context in yourself.
So subject matter expertise, that's one sort of very practical, actionable piece of advice you're giving, Thomas. Something else you said that I think is very powerful is this idea that not all data has to be governed to the nth degree, has to be as reliable as all other data sets. And so thinking in terms of a hierarchy, I think is very valuable. Yeah. There's a cost to ensuring data accuracy or pushing for accuracy, and the cost of 100% accuracy is very, very high. Yeah. So it's only worth paying that cost where that data is used in applications where that accuracy is really required. And there are some, but they're certainly not all. And that brings me on to what I think is a framing that is helpful for people who are thinking about tackling these kind of issues in their organization, which is data isn't collected, it's manufactured. So there is a process that happens from the point of creation to the point of consumption in an application. And for data that you have a high degree of assurance that it's accurate, you can only ever have assurance, you can't ever be sure because it is your source of truth. you essentially want to really well understand and govern every stage in that data production process. And the data is only as good as the weakest link in that production. So in the case of behavioral data or event data, which is obviously where I'm skewed, you've got to think about everything from the point of collection. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about tracking and how you make it easy for developers to set up accurate tracking, and all the different techniques and tricks to spot issues that emerge there, but all the way through to every subsequent step in the analysis, and that can step in the processing, and that can include machine learning steps if an inference is made on the data, and that can include Gen AI steps that you might want to eval on. But a basic starting point has to be that you can observe that complete pipeline, and that you have owners of the different parts of the pipeline, and and it's just like a manufacturing pipeline.
Quality assurance as well. That's all. And the ownership is interesting. How do you see the ownership split in a business, Yali? Is this always the data team that owns it? Is this split across different data generation teams?
So we see a mix of models. There's the pattern I most commonly see is pendulum. So organizations will often come to us because they're building these more advanced applications, some of these machine learning use cases and so on top of their behavioral data. And at that point, and we haven't really talked about how data quality issues manifest, but at that point, someone will say, this isn't going to work, the data's not good enough. Or there's too much inconsistency, we can't even bring the data together to build a single customer view or some of these building blocks to do the kind of analysis we want. And at that point, you have this push. A central team is empowered to go and try and fix it all, which I think is risky. It's nice, but it's risky because it takes time and it takes effort. And even if that team owns it all, they have to work with the whole business, everybody involved to get that.
For startups, by the way, folks, is easy, but for bigger companies, it's a massive other challenge.
I mean, enterprise is kind of impossible to do it all in one. You have to divide it into chunks, and then so that happens. And if that is successful, and more often than not it is, but it can fail if the scope is too big. Then there is a push to decentralize, and that's driven by the data team becoming a bottleneck.
Yes.
And that's where ideas like data mesh and so on really take off. So we see centralization and decentralization, but even then it's not uniform. There'll be certain core data products or items of data that matter across the business. They'll be centrally governed, and then things that can be managed by the individual teams. But the key thing is that there has to be an owner, because if there isn't an owner, there isn't somebody responsible for making sure this process is running smoothly, you've got no assurance that process is doing what it should do. The data that comes out the end can't be trusted.
Yeah. And do you think this division of labor, does this follow output metrics? So following what metrics that matter type of frameworks, where essentially you look at what the company is trying to achieve. Every team will then have particular metrics they're trying to achieve in their own quarter to enable this wider company North Star goal. And those metrics are typically composite metrics that are things like customer lifetime value, which requires a good understanding of transactions, of revenue, of VAT, but also of customer behavior on the website. Do you see the sort of division of labor happening on that level, or does it happen really on the data creation level itself? Because I can make arguments in both directions.
Yeah, I don't think there's a right answer or wrong answer. I think so the more common pattern I see is, and I'll share it, and then I want to see what your view is, Thomas. Is there'll be a split on the data creation side, because you have,
for sure,
different product engineering teams that are responsible for different parts of the product,
and they own the code.
They own the code. It makes sense that they own the data that comes off it, and if they're like doing their jobs right, they should really care about that data and be using it. And one of the most important things I think a data team can do is get those teams consuming their own data.
Get a feedback loop set up 100%.
Because then they're drinking their own.
That's a good piece of advice, folks. That's
if you don't do that, everything is harder. So you invest each team in wanting to.
They need to know why they're
publish.
tracking this data and why they need to govern it. Absolutely.
So that's great. And then I like the data mesh model of the people that are building the data products that consume that data, the reports, the dashboards, the AI models, the agentic applications, to own their derivation of the data sets and the data pipelines that they've built that take those different source data sets and turn them into
insight.
into insights. That can be overkill. There are some organizations that thinking in terms of metrics is great. I don't think that's wrong.
Really silo those a little bit, yeah.
But like most of the organizations, at least I've worked with, are messier. And that might be a failure of imagination on my part to really think through how you can break them down into.
I think we see the same thing. I've never encountered an organization that said what we want is a decentralized source of truth. And they always want. I think the way to think about it for us is maybe less about the event analytics manufacturing side of things, but more about how does your data stack, what does it look like if you start drawing it out on paper? And for us, the perfect data stack for growing businesses in particular, for a couple of reasons, but for bigger businesses as well, is a relatively narrow-waisted one where you might have a big fan out of or fan in, I should say, of data sources, but they all go into a very narrow data model that structures the data into the objects and entities that the business actually cares about, which in most businesses is maybe 10, 15, 20 objects and entities. And then it fans out again to all the different data consumers, whether that's dashboards, reporting, notebooks for analysis, or GenAI applications. And seeing a metric as something that's developed in that narrow ways to the data model is very, I think, it brings a lot of clarity to exactly who should own this metric and why someone should own it. And for me, the natural owner of the metric sits in the data consumption layer, but the natural owner for the data sources and what data they provide sits very much in the team that generates that data. So that means the product team indeed owning the data that's generated on the website. The backend, maybe RevOps team owning the data that's created in the financial backends, right? And having the data team really operate as an internal consultancy almost, I should say, but I'm biased, obviously, to make sure that you coordinate the data creation between the different teams and say, hey, RevOps guys, yeah, we want you to create the financial transactions, but maybe don't worry too much about whether a user has started to check out. That's something we can actually deal better with on the front end to do the coordination in that way. But the front end probably shouldn't track transaction value because that would be a very lossy event because you're not going to be able to track every front end event because of the current privacy landscape and everything around that. So having that divide and conquer role be coordinated by the data team, that's a very important role. And that's exactly why you need business analysis and subject matter expertise in your data team, if of course your data team is big enough to contain all of that. So that's the way I think about it. I think it's a slightly different version of what you said, Yali. But
no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's I only heard the hourglass sort of language yesterday for the first time, but it makes a lot of sense for that very well governed core data set that like all businesses have. That makes sense. I think around that you can have all kinds of experimentation and other things.
Absolutely, of course,
going on.
You don't want it slowing down. No.
I'm really if I think about organizations, like I'm imagining the folks that are dialing into this webinar, they're going to be in organizations that are at different stages. Some will have very advanced data governance initiatives, lots of clear ownership, observability, be able to map out all their data pipelines, their data manufacturing, their data products, and so on. But I know that a great many organizations aren't there yet. And actually the art is in getting from a state of like low trust and a fair amount of mess to the sort of promised land that lots of people write about, but they tend to write about what it looks like when you get there, not about the journey to get there. So I'm kind of dying to ask you, Thomas, what is your advice to organizations that there might be a data team that's just been spun up, but that's trying to do some things, or someone else in the business that's trying to use data and they realize, the organization's not where it needs to be, how do you go from realizing that there's a problem and data quality is a part of that to actually solving it?
Oof. It takes
Little
time.
question.
Yeah, it takes time, and as they say, it's not the destination, right? It's the friends you make along the way that count here. There's some truth in that for data teams, because again, certainly if you're starting out in a data team or you've got a newfound New Year's impetus and energy to start solving these problems, go and talk to the teams that are data generating, so typically engineering team or product teams, and go to the teams that are actually consuming the output and make sure that you got a really good read on the priorities of those data consuming teams, so that you can then talk to the data generating teams and say, hey, look, I know you're generating 100 different event types here. These are the 5 that actually matter because John in marketing needs them for his marketing performance report, or Sue in the product marketing team needs them for her user funnel reports. So always having a really good assessment of what's tier 1, what's actually important, what's seen by the board on a month-by-month level, what's seen by the C-suite on a day-by-day, week-by-week level is really important, because it allows you to prioritize what you need to do, because you're not going to solve this in a week or 2 weeks across the board. Second, that prioritization will then tell you if you're building a data model and an hourglass data stack from scratch. Always happy to help with that, by the way. But if you're doing that from scratch, then you know where to start. You know what metrics that you need to start providing, and you can work your way back from those metrics to see what events you need for that. And then don't be afraid to just build this anew from scratch. Don't worry too much about legacy data or legacy events if what you care about is really getting to those metrics as quickly as possible, because you can then always do a one-off migration of your historical data sets into the new structure. And the third bit I say around data quality is having a very good understanding of different types of data. And what I mean by that is there's objective data and subjective data. So objective data is typically synonymous with event data, where a page view is quite objective, a checkout event is quite objective, a conversion event is quite objective. It's much easier to guarantee the trustworthiness of objective events than it is to guarantee the trustworthiness of subjective aggregated data. Aggregated data is lifetime value. Aggregated data is revenue in Spain last week. Aggregated data is cohort onboarding completion rates, because these are data points that rely on not just the data being captured and manufactured accurately, but also on data modeling being done properly. And so you can't easily debug a problem there, whereas you can quite easily debug problems on the objective data side. So reducing your, actually, with all data problems, trying to steal some solutions from engineering typically helps. So separate your concerns, modularize your problem set, modularize your complex problem into multiple smaller problems that you can then sort of start prioritizing and solve one by one. And the one thing that really works for us is to split into the priorities what are tier 1 metrics that you need to get right as quickly as possible. Work your way back to the metric, to the events necessary, the data necessary for that, and then split between objective data points and subjective data points, and know how you're going to debug and stress test them is probably the sort of quite concrete advice that I give that works well. And don't overpromise what you can do in a short amount of time. This does take time. If you have a lot of legacy data that you need to transport, it's going to cost even more time. But you're going to save yourself a huge amount of frustration, reconciliation, and other headaches down the line if you just do it right from the start. There's no time like the present to do that. And then maybe one other thing I'd say is that when you are talking about metrics definitions and you are talking about objective versus subjective data, it is quite an instructive exercise to engage the company in those definitions. Maybe not necessarily for, hey, at exactly what point should the page view event be fired off for the front-end web page, because there's a simple, clean answer to that. And typically it's more technical discussion anyway. But more about things like, hey, I'm building a lead qualification scoring algorithm is one of the big pieces of insight. What is the definition of a lead? Can we have to chat first with the sales team and the marketing team and the product team, because they're probably going to have 3 different answers to what a lead actually means, and surfacing those definitions up front will really help you not just solve any data quality issues down the line, because you want to make sure that if not one central definition of a lead, you have 3 different definitions of a lead that are clearly labeled as separate. But it will also force people to think a bit beyond their own internal team and think about, well, actually, do we need to align as a business around what the definition of a lead is, and can we go from there? That's more of an abstract point, but I just wanted to throw it in for free here, Yali.
No, it's interesting, Thomas. One thing that strikes me listening to all the advice, and there's so many, there's so much good advice packed into to what you said, is there's sort of tactical organizational wisdom there around, look, there's a lot to do. You need some way to prioritize. Start with the key metrics that drive the business, or the key things that the people in the business that are consuming this data need. And so having some view of that and using that to drive this is really important. And I think we haven't sort of said it explicitly, but data quality is as much an organizational problem as a technical
very much
problem. So you also talked a lot about sort of different technical approaches and how, some things are simpler with objective metrics than subjective. But just to stay at the kind of organizational level, because I think those are the harder problems to solve. Data quality is something that, like, everybody can get upset about. You don't need to be an expert in data to not trust data and to get angry with data people and with data and not use the data. But it's a very hard thing, I think, to engage the business in working to solve, which is difficult because, like, as you've rightly pointed out, so much of the solution requires engaging with other people. You've got to engage with the domain experts to understand the data and understand how the data's used. You've got to engage with the teams that are producing the data to drive up the data quality. You've got to engage with the teams that are modeling the data, so they build those pipelines. So you've got to engage with the data. You've got to engage with everybody to make sure you're using the same definitions to come to the advice that, and that's hard. It's hard to get a busy person to stop doing what they're doing, which is, maybe they're in marketing and their job is to drive leads and hit targets, and to have a sort of, it feels like a philosophical discussion about what is a lead. So how do you think about sort of incentivizing people to become part of the conversation and to win over stakeholders?
That's the hard part, and this is why great data teams see their role very much as a business role, and bring a bunch of business consulting and business analysis skills to their daily toolbox of methods and tricks and so on and so on. I like your framing that this is not simple, and that the path of least resistance for most teams is, I'm afraid, to keep digging the hole and keep using the reports that they know are not very accurate, to keep downloading the data that they do trust but is at too granular a level into Excel, and just run their own pivots on top of it, which is something that almost every team out there does if they're not owning the data sets themselves. And so I think as a data team, it's important that you don't work in a separate reality, but if you are really aware of where that happens in your business, whether people trust the data that they're consuming, and whether you have a good idea of what they actually need to get to. And that, I don't think you can shortcut that. I think that awareness of how big the problem is and who's impacted by it, you need to start with that, regardless of what else you do. But maybe that is just a matter of going to actually to talk to the teams for an hour at a time, and maybe that doesn't cost you more than a few days in order to get through that. And particularly if you're starting as, say, a head of data and a new team, or again, if you found this 2025 New Year's energy and want to do something new in your team, that's something you could start with, mapping out a problem. In terms of convincing the business then to put resources behind it, because that's at the end of the day what you're talking about, is the business aware enough of the cost right now to warrant the investment in solving data quality once and for all, and then data quality not just a reductive vision of just events, but data quality is in trustworthiness, good data model design, and so on and so on. I would argue that it pays off to think about the consequences of not doing it. So the cost of not fixing data quality I think there's two factors there. One is making decisions based on wrong data, which is fairly obvious. You can't operate a business in the blind, but it's what's even worse than operating in the blind is operating with wrong data, right? So you don't want to crash the business into a mountain by having an overinflated idea of customer lifetime value because someone added VAT to it and they shouldn't have 5 years ago. That happens. I've got some scar tissue. But the other bit is probably also the opportunity cost. And even if you've got current workarounds in most teams to ensure that they got some amount of data quality confidence, mostly it is by taking the reins into their own hand, not trusting the data model, but downloading the raw data themselves from Stripe and just doing their own analysis. Then I'd say quantifying what the art of the possible, showing them what they could do with a proper centralized data set, showing that, hey, now you're just looking at raw Stripe data because that's the only data you trust. But actually, imagine you could join this with our customer segmentation from marketing. Imagine you could join this with your lifetime value models that we have in order to understand what type of customer is making these transactions. And that, again, requires you as a data team to be quite articulate about what you can do with the data sources and why that is important. If you find yourself not able to articulate the value or the cost of particular data challenges, maybe the challenges are not as big as you might think they are, because it's another, I think, pitfall for most data teams to mainly think technical and mainly think about data quality as a technical problem with technical consequences. And then you might very easily see a major problem in a subsystem somewhere around A/B testing data accuracy. But maybe it turns out that when you actually talk to the product team, they're not really using the insights result from that anyway, or they're just using it for button color testing or something like that, where it just doesn't matter that much whether or not you're looking at fully accurate data. And that then comes back into play, Yali, what we said earlier, where there's tiering of hierarchies of data sets, where you're able to understand whether or not you're looking at something that's key and core, like revenue numbers, or whether you're looking at something that's where just a relative thumb in the air directional insight is more important. And we don't care that much about the preciseness of the latter category. So that's my sort of quick thinking there, is to take stock, analyze and map out a problem, try to quantify the cost, and try and understand the opportunity cost and what you could do instead. And if you can't really have answers to those, then maybe it's not a massive problem. You can deprioritize it a little bit.
That makes sense, Thomas. The two things that I've seen time and time again in the most successful data teams that we work with are a data leader that has really good relationships with senior leadership and understand the world from their perspective and is focused on making them happy. Mm-hmm. And then the thing that follows from that is a very a maniacal focus on delivering a use case at a time.
Yes.
And often the use cases are surprising. They're not what I have assumed are the most impactful to the business, but they're the ones that drive the attention. They're the ones that get the senior leadership team excited. They're the ones that are easy to quantify the value. Mm-hmm. And the data leaders will spend the time celebrating the success and making sure everybody understands that before going on to the second use case. And then kind of a head of steam builds, and the organization sort of learns that these wonderful things will happen if you work with this team and invest in and do all these things that seem alien to them, like define the metrics and debate exactly what the definition of this thing is, or invest in that extra data engineer to pipe this data into that. We're going to go into Q&A quite shortly. I'm trying to figure out whether, because the question I desperately want to ask is to get you to share with us one or two examples of organizations that have done this. And I'm wondering if we should go to Q&A first, and then if there's time, come back.
I'll say one quick thing on the back of what you just said. I think showing the art of the possible as a data leader is really important. So that means building those relationships with the rest of the business, not just senior leadership, but with the rest of the business, understanding what the marketing team is getting up with every morning as problems and trying to solve for those, rather than solving to some theoretical construct of what you think the marketing team might be working on. But also, I think showing and not telling. And of course, we're talking about this over here, Yali, which is very easy of us. But it's one of the reasons why I like to think of Tasman as an agency rather than just a consultancy. We try to do the work. We operate as a fractional team, and we show how we think it should be done. We don't just build decks and tell people how we think it should be done in abstract. We actually get our hands dirty and make these prioritization decisions. But yeah, the prioritization, building the relationships, really showing the art of the possible, and making sure you deeply understand the interests and challenges and struggles of the different teams. That's the main takeaway there. But you know all of that. I think it's just to give you the confidence that those are indeed the ways to get through this.
Awesome. Well, let's go to the Q&A, because I want to make sure we answer
absolutely
as many questions as possible.
Or any hot takes that you might have about this, please put them in the Q&A as well, and we'll give you our live reaction.
So Thomas, I'll read this out because the monitor's small. I don't. It says more and more of the content presented on the web is generated by AI. There is a concern that LLMs will hit a wall in terms of new content to learn from. i.e. majority. Oh, and that's disappeared before. So I think I've got the gist of the question.
Because we need to go to the answered question.
Oh,
there
okay. Oh, yes, sorry. I'm learning. So the majority of inputs AI uses to generate responses has come from previous AI outputs. Do you have any thoughts on how we can ensure that AI is continuously learning from human inputs, especially when it comes to event tracking? That's a great question. Yeah. I'll throw that over to you, Thomas, before I share my own thoughts.
We're doing quite a bit of thinking about that over the last couple of months, because we're building agentic models that are tailored to business analysis and data analysis, and that's not a simple thing, because it's not quite sufficient to run with the sort of out of the box world models from OpenAI or Anthropic and so on and so on. And one of the things that we've found is that on the training side of things, not all AI generated content is created equally, and actually some of it is really useful to build and train on top of. So I don't personally believe that we'll hit a wall when it comes to training content. I think that these AI engines are getting really powerful when it comes to recursive reasoning, meaning that they give a first stab at an answer and then analyze all the different ways the answer could be wrong and analyze from there. That doesn't mean that they're AGI or that they're actually reasoning in the way that we understand it, but it does make for a much more well-considered approach to some of the answers that you get from these models. And so I think that I'm not too worried about that, because I think the models themselves can take care of quite a bit of the quality assurance there. When it comes to the broader question about how we can make sure that AIs can keep learning from our content. Secondly, I think that the best way that I see analysts at the moment work with agents is not in a very binary input question, get answer, put answer into client deck. Right? That's not how this works. How this works well is you help it structure your own current thinking. You iterate not once or twice, but 20 times to make sure you get the exact right prompt and kind of work on top of a context that you help it build. So in that sense, it's much more of a synergy of thinking and reasoning that is very much human in the loop rather than the AI on its own. And so I think we're only at the start of exploring that further. As with all things, my main message to our own team, but to everybody working with AI agents, is only really use the output of these agents, even after iteration, for things where you can recognize whether it's wrong or not. And that means that, for instance, it's really compelling to use it for coding applications, because you can instantly tell whether it's working or not in many ways, particularly if you modularize your questions quite heavily. You can use it for marketing, because you can instantly tell, or at least I hope so, whether the content it produces is meaningful and valuable. Using it for building your 5-year business plan, I'm not so sure, right? As in, it's not necessarily going to bring the creativity and the reality check that they would need to have in order to be valuable there.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm going to pick up on just the last thing that the sort of questioner said, which was what about especially when it comes to event tracking, and that's because that's something that we've been thinking about and doing some quite interesting research at Snowplow. So when people are building agentic apps, they're using the LLM as a general purpose reasoning engine, which they're they're great at, but then they're having them operate on their own data through some kind of RAG. And the one pattern that seems very promising is graph RAG. And the nice thing about graph RAG is it's human sort of understandable. So you can go into the graph, you can understand the nodes and edges, and make sure that the model that you built in the graph you think is accurate. It sort of passes the squint test, and you can start thinking about all the tests and the approaches to data quality to populate that graph that you do with any kind of data pipeline process. And so we're starting to experiment with loading Snowplow data into graphs and doing graph RAG on that. And those experiments are promising. Still doesn't mean that the LLM won't hallucinate, but there are sort of other things you can do to deal with that. So hope to share more on that in the
that'd be cool, because I think
future.
that is a starting point for the how shall I say, the knowledge maps that we really strongly believe in, giving the LLMs tiered and hierarchical context around what's objective data, what is subjective data, versus what's general context that is a brain dump from the CEO in Notion, so to speak, which maybe should be taken less serious than the objective data points. So I think the graph RAG is something that will be really interesting there. When it comes to event analytics itself, I think it's a bit academic, because even with RAG, you're going to hit context limits quite quickly if you start feeding in a lot of raw data, and event data is the rawest data you can think of. And so we've always chosen to pre-aggregate before we feed any data into these tools, and therefore already bring some amount of human in the loop centralization / aggregation of data in there. But I think that if you think about agent workflows, where you're talking about sequenced agents rather than one single agent to rule them all, then I can definitely think about kind of graph RAG on top of an event database that allows you to very quickly even you can already build stuff right now that just writes the SQL on top of Snowflake if you want to operate in that way, or you can feed it raw data and see whether it can aggregate it itself. So there's many ways to play with it and to make it work within your particular workflows. Not too worried about that either. Yeah.
I think one of the really nice things about these graph representations is you can aggregate over them. So
of course, yeah.
They have some of those benefits of SQL, but they're a much more expressive way of.
So is SQL finally dead in that case, Yali, or where?
That's a good question. We're probly too close to the end.
Too close
of the webinar,
to the end. Yeah, that's true. Join us next week. Yeah.
Another question. Thomas, what metrics should we prioritize when we measure data quality?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I'm going to go for the hot take here. I'm going to go for the actual usage of your end reports and dashboards. So for me, it is about trust rather than about governance. So yes, I can say success rates on unit tests or regression tests that you're building in the data warehouse, but they're all built towards your business stakeholders who are consuming these reports for the decision making, whether they trust the data or not. And at the end of the day, the North Star, so not necessarily the actionable metric, but the North Star is whether your business outcomes improve, right? But it's not very actionable. So I would say you will see the activation and usage of dashboards be the main health metric for whether or not your data quality is there. And it's not even that lagging, because I think if you've spent the effort, if you expended the effort to build a highly trustworthy data set, build highly trustworthy dashboards that meet your stakeholders' needs in terms of meeting them where they are and making the decisions rather than trying to build something in the abstract for them. From the moment that you messed up the data quality once or twice, you're going to see usage of the dashboards plummet straight away. And all of a sudden, they're going to export the data from Stripe themselves manually. Or they're going to go to a deeper level in the data warehouse and go from there, or they're just going to stop using it in the first place. And so using dashboard usage as a main metric is important. Maybe it's still quite lagging as an indicator. Maybe I'm wrong about that in some organizations. And so I'm trying to think of a bit more of a leading indicator here. But I think those are all leading indicators I can think of are technical. They're about failure rates in the event governance framework. They are about typically actually a good proxy for trustworthiness of data is how many different event types you have. If you got 5,000, I'm going to guarantee that you probably don't have a highly trustworthy data model on the back of all of that. But I think I'm going to go.
I like
with,
your hot take. I like. I'm not going to disagree with that.
No.
I think that's right, and I don't think it's a lagging indicator. So you've persuaded me, Thomas. Maybe I'm an easy person to be persuaded.
Just always second guessing ourselves, Yali. That's what we're supposed to do.
So look, we've got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the question I've been dying to ask. Can you share with us an example of like one of the many clients that you've worked with, taking them from a point where their data quality wasn't where it ought to be, and what it was that was like, how did that manifested, and through to a better place. So hopefully something that brings together some of the themes that we've talked about in abstract in a concrete way, so that our listeners can go away. So no pressure.
No pressure. And I'd love to talk about all of my clients, but of course I need some permission for some of those. I think one example that was really powerful that we've spoken about in public in the past is a company called Paired. They're a relationship improvement app. They're available in the App Store. They're really good. They're friends of mine that built it a couple of years ago, coming out of the previous company I worked for. They were running a classic end-to-end CDP with the classic problem of having 50 different versions of the same event type, with the classic problem of not really having any proper modeling done on top of that. We came in to set up a proper centralized data stack for them that allowed them to have all the marketing data centralized and under one roof. And that's hard because particularly for mobile apps, you don't really get that much truth out of the app stores. So you need to build quite a bit of clever logic in order to understand how many Facebook installs did I have yesterday, how many Snapchat installs did I have yesterday, how many organic installs did I have yesterday, and then attribute all of that back to the revenue that you're getting from those installs as well. But we built that for them, and that allowed them to, within that sort of very narrow-waisted data model that you then build on top of that, to very quickly build quick insight tables to help them not just at some point when their return on ad spend was going down heavily, to not just identify that was happening, but also identify immediately where it was happening and where the hopeful signs of, hey, actually these particular advertising channels are increasing in ROAS, so therefore let's boost these channels and cut down those channels over there. There's an immediate example of how within a matter of months you can turn a business that has zero visibility about their marketing spend, just has blended customer acquisition cost, blended ROAS as metrics, and turn it into a performance marketing powerhouse where you can immediately see the impact of your campaign spending and which campaigns are working well and which campaigns are working not well. And the reason I use their example is because they turned the ship around. They managed to increase their ROAS again based on those recommendations that you could make immediately within weeks, and increase revenue massively on the back of all of that. And so that's what it shall I say, and that's a really nice outcome.
And I imagine imagine after an experience like that, everybody's sold on the value of the data platform, and the approach,
absolutely.
and the focus on data quality. How soon after the project kickoff did that sort of moment happen?
We like to operate as minimally as possible. So we went in first for a few months to build a central platform. And then we actually came in again after pausing for, I think, 6 to 9 months because we hand over to the internal teams and then they can manage it themselves. We came in because they needed some analysis support just to run the analysis, not to build infrastructure. And so within just 2 or 3 sprints of running that analysis, we had the outcomes and the effects guaranteed there. So yeah, so this was a year and a half after we started work with them, but there was a year break in between where they were just managing all of that themselves. It's very nice.
Very cool. So look, we're at the top of the hour. So thanks very much for joining us today. It's been thank you, Thomas. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
Thank you, everybody who's
I always learn so much,
in.
Yali.
We've got some links up. Do please follow up if you're interested in learning more about Snowplow.
Absolutely.
And Tasman. It's a very generous offer from from Thomas on the free consultation, and he and his team are a wealth of knowledge. So
And
highly
don't
recommend
wait,
you,
because I'm going on holiday in a few weeks. So get those consults in as quickly as you can.
Brilliant. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.